Hi, this is Justin of SonicScoop, and you are listening to the SonicScoop podcast, where we talk about the mindsets behind mixing and mastering, and about treating your career in music or sound like the creative business that it is. And today we're going to do a little bit of a technical episode. We haven't done this in a little while. We're going to be talking about EQ strategies, boosting versus cutting. When should you boost EQs? When should you cut with EQs? What are the pros and cons of each? And how do you know whether you should be boosting or cutting to get where you want to go? I'm going to offer you some strategies for that. And we're going to get right into it after, here's the test, whether you can get through the briefest of sponsor shout-out sections. It's about 90 seconds long, maybe shorter. And the most important sponsor always is you. Your ratings and reviews on iTunes and your smashing of the like button on the YouTube helps more people hear this podcast, which is tremendous for everyone. Big new sponsor for this week. Going to give you something for a discount. DistroKid. If you haven't heard of them, they're a great way to get your music out there onto iTunes, Spotify, Tidal, Google Play, all that stuff. And you can get a 7% discount on the DistroKid service by typing in distrokid.com/VIP/SonicScoop. And you'll get your 7% discount for your first year on DistroKid. There is probably one of the easiest and most cost-effective ways to upload music. Another big, super quick shout out before we talk about this EQ stuff is Focusrite. I'm talking through a Focusrite interface right now, the Claret 2 Pre. They make some amazing interfaces. Definitely check them out if you're shopping for one. And last but not least, Eventide, making some of my favorite software and audio effects. Check out any of the software they make for free at eventideaudio.com. Great stuff. Now let's talk about actually using this stuff. EQs. Let's get right into it. To boost or to cut? That is the question. Whether it is nobler to something suffer the possible side effects of boosting too much and having too much fun doing it, or to raise your hand and end it all by saying, this frequency sucks, let's cut it. Okay. I really think that the biggest thing here when it comes to boosting with your EQs versus cutting with your EQs is much more about mindset than it is about sound. It's much more about the mental state that you put yourself into. And I want you to think about that when you're thinking about these strategies, because realistically, you can achieve almost any EQ curve possible with any number of strategies. Just for instance, if you were to cut 400 hertz, you could get a really similar effect to cutting 400 hertz by, say, boosting everything from 100 hertz on down while also boosting everything from 1600 hertz on up. Depending on how, wide that cut filter is, you can get similar effects with both a boost or a cut. So a lower mid-range cut is a lot like, in practice, a low frequency boost coupled with some higher frequency boost as well, and vice versa. Rather than shelving up low end and shelving up high end, you can get a similar effect by doing a mid-range cut somewhere. And it's not just that either. If you're going to boost, say, 4K, that has a similar effect to the human ear as cutting a lower frequency. Or if you were to boost or cut 100 hertz, that actually has a similar effect to the human ear, maybe boosting a frequency, higher up in the 6 or 8K range. So there are certain low frequency cuts that sound a lot to us like a upper mid-range or high frequency boost, and vice versa. And you could, with enough, effort, get almost the same EQ result using totally different EQ filters. So that's possible. So with that long little preamble aside, then why boost versus why cut? And I think a big thing here is mindset. And a lot of the magazines and a lot of the college professors and folks will teach you, don't boost too much. You're more likely to get artifacts and issues boosting. It's much safer to cut. And I think that this advice comes up a lot because when people are cutting, they're often doing so with narrow bandwidth. And when you're cutting with a narrow bandwidth, you're not affecting that many frequencies. And it takes a deeper cut to mess things up more when you're dealing with a relatively narrow bandwidth when it comes to cutting. So when you are cutting, in general, narrower bandwidths tend to work better. You can get too much of like a weird scooped hollow out sound if you go with really wide bandwidths when cutting, meaning affecting a lot of frequencies at once. And if you're boosting, you can get weird, annoying, ringing artifacts if you boost with too narrow of a bandwidth. wider bandwidths tend to be better for boosting, where you're affecting more frequencies and you're less likely to get issues with unwanted resonances and weirdness and stuff like that. So I think both are safe to do as long as you're erring on the side of narrower, and when you're boosting, erring on the side of wider bandwidths, of adjusting more frequencies. But each puts you into a different mindset. And despite all of the finger-wagging advice you may have read out there of don't boost too much, boosting is a lot more fun. And it puts you into a much more fun mindset. One of the pieces of advice you might get early on in mixing and mastering is to sweep your EQs. And this is not the first time that I'm going to recommend that you not rely too heavily on that habit. So the sweeping your EQs trick that a lot of people hear about cutting early on is probably the best, safest way to cut, is to sweep your EQs. Do a big boost, sweep it low, sweep it high, and find out which frequency sounds the most annoying, and then cut that one out. And that's going to be your safest and best way to EQ. And to a degree, that is potentially true, and is actually a great way to train your ears early on. I've said that in the past as well. And if you've never tried this approach before, it's worth trying for a while to help train your ears, help figure out what different parts of the frequency spectrum sound like. You will get an ear workout by saying, oh, that's what 500 hertz sounds like compared to 1,000 hertz. And sweeping can be a good exercise. And it's true that you can identify annoying sounding frequencies with this method. But there are two problems with this method. One, assuming you're not in an ideally treated room on ideal speakers, you can identify frequencies that sound annoying, not because they're annoying in the recording, but because they're annoying in your room. You might have a big resonance, a big hump in your room at 140 hertz. And when you get to 140 hertz and that sweep, it sounds terrible. So you cut out a ton of 140 hertz. But guess what? 140 hertz, it really was fine in the recording. It just sucked in your room. So now you're trying to overcompensate for problems with your room by your EQ. And when you're doing a big boost and sweeping, you are going to notice a lot of areas that sound terrible, particularly if you're in a not well-treated room. And you're going to end up overcorrecting and sucking the life out of things because you're applying this technique in an environment that's not ideally suited for. So that's one problem with this technique. Another problem is that cutting puts you in a mindset of looking for what's wrong with things in the recording, with things in the mix. And having too critical of a mindset when you are mixing or mastering or doing anything in audio can make you really overwork sounds and make them sound worse. When you get too critical, when instead of accepting sounds for what they are and trying to make the most out of them, when you're trying to think of everything that's wrong with every sound, it's not a fun way to work. It kind of puts you in a negative mindset. It almost makes you hate the recording engineer, which might have been you, or hate the artist, for not doing things well enough because you're in this super critical, subtractive mindset of taking things away. Boosting, on the other hand, it has this benefit of putting you in the mindset of thinking about what to enhance, what sounds great, and what can we add to it. Now, the problem here, especially early on before you've developed a little bit of sophistication with EQ, is you can overdo things a little bit on that end too, right? You can get like a little manic, right? So the problem potentially with boosting too much is mania, is going overboard, pushing things too hard, loving this thing and hitting it as hard as you can. And the potential side effect of too much subtractive EQ is depression, right? So hopefully by balancing both of these approaches in your work, you don't become manic depressive, but ideally a balanced person and a more balanced mixer. So I want you to think about this a little bit, get your own mindset together and think about your approach. What have you been doing too much? There's a chance that you are erring on the side of cutting too much and getting into too critical of a mindset with your work. And I find that it happens with a lot of studious, but still newer producer engineers who are very cautious, very careful. They don't want to mess things up. They go with a subtractive approach, but they never go out there and say, you know what this track needs? We need to ramp up 100 hertz, and we can do that by 3 or 4 dB. Let's do it. Let's make a bold move. You know what this needs? This needs a whole hell of a lot of 10K. Let's just put it up there. No, 1 dB, that's too small. Let's hammer it. Let's do a few dB boosts, or more. And during mixing, sometimes big moves are okay. And one of the things that stands in the way of a lot of people who could be mixing better is timidity around using their EQ. They're too cautious. They're not pushing things enough. On the other hand, there are some people who are maybe a little less studious and a little less cautious, particularly very early on, this type of personality. They're boosting everything. And they're saying, we need a whole bunch of 100 hertz. Let's boost it 10, 20 dB. They're doing all this stuff and everything sounds distorted and terrible. Every once in a while, though, people with that kind of personality can have really great results because they're being bold. They're not afraid of making really creative decisions. And I would say that the problem I find more often is with the more cautious type when it comes to audio and music production. Because people who are attracted to audio and music production, they tend to be somewhat more studious maybe by nature than, say, someone who's attracted to being a singer, right? So many more people, I think, in our field have that problem of holding themselves back too much, of being overly critical and cutting too much and being too much like a perfectionist. That's just more often the personality trait that you're going to find problems with in our field. And I also think that the advice of don't boost too much has been repeated so much in so many outlets that's more likely to be the thing that people don't do wrong. So I don't know what your situation is, but I feel like there's a pretty good chance that if you're listening to this and you had the attention span to get through a 90-second sponsor section, that maybe your problem is just that you're not being bold enough with EQs. And here's the thing with being bold about EQs. It's okay to go too far and then reel it back a little bit. You may have remembered this from the episode I talked to you about that technique about honing in on level settings, that you're never going to put the fader in the right place and just get it there moment one, just instinctively know, oh, this fader should be at -6 dB. No, that doesn't happen. What happens is you hone in, you put the level a little bit too hot, then you bring it down a little bit too low, and then you find a spot in the middle. And maybe you go back and forth a few times, but you're finding the boundaries of what's too high and what's too low, and then narrowing down your choices. The same comes with EQ, and it is okay to go too far at first when you're EQing. Do a little bit more boost than you think you need, a little bit more cut than you think you need. Then listen to it that way, settle in and say, this is the right direction. This does sound better, but I'm pushing it a little bit too far. It sounds a little artificial, or it's just a little bit too much. And now let me, instead of having a 6 dB boost, we'll do a 4 dB boost. And instead of having a 5 dB cut, we'll have a 3 dB cut. Maybe you end up there. But through this strategy of allowing yourself to overdo it a little bit just to find the right sound, you might end up finding out when a 10 dB boost is really what the track needed. And you wouldn't have done it unless you gave yourself the license to push and to add more rather than just focusing on subtracting and playing it safe all the time. I'll give you just a little quick story before I say bye to you on this one, but I hope it kind of hammers it home. There was a client of mine, repeat client. He had mixed a lot of his own stuff. I actually mixed a couple of records for him, but then he was mixing, some stuff by himself when I was mastering, and he wanted me to master his mixes for him. And he sent me this electronic track he was working on. He had done a lot of indie rock, indie pop stuff in the past. Now he's getting into this electronic idiom and trying to make, some club banger tracks and try his hand at that. And he sent me this track and he said, I don't know, man, it doesn't have all that life to it. It's supposed to sound like, Major Lazer or Skrillex or something like that. It's supposed to have all this bombast, and it's just not getting there. And I don't know what I'm doing wrong. So he sent me the track, and I listened to the kind of records that he was loving the sound of, and I mastered it for him, and I sent it back to him, and he said, oh my goodness, this track sounds totally different than what I sent you. It's like another planet. It went from sounding like this dull, flat mix I got by myself to now mastered. It's like 3D living color, but like coming at you with psychedelic fangs coming out of its mouth. It's totally gnarly. It's awesome. What did you do? And I told him everything that you were afraid to. I compressed it too much. I limited it too much. I did EQ boosts that were too big, and I did EQ cuts that were probably too aggressive. But that's what it took to end up sounding like these totally gnarly, vicious tracks that you love the sound of. Now, obviously, I'm not saying that every kind of track needs that treatment. There are so many tracks that come into me for mastering where I do like a dB boost in the low end and a dB cut at 8K and a half dB lift at 12K, and like that's it. Sometimes they can be even smaller than that. But more often than not, unless we're talking classical or jazz, really neutral, idiom, folk, or whatever, unless we're talking about those idioms, more often than not, the times where I don't have to do too much during mastering, it's because the mixing engineer wasn't afraid to make some big, bold decisions on his or her side, which is where those big, bold decisions really should be made. So this is me. In case you needed permission, you don't need permission, but in case you needed permission to boost more and go more aggressive with your EQ, feel free. You shouldn't always do it. And the advice that's out there of don't EQ too much and don't boost too much, there's some truth to it. But there's a chance that that's not your problem. And there's a chance that your problem isn't that you're too bold, but you're too cautious. And honestly, I think most people, when they're frustrated with where they are in mixing and the results they're getting, especially the kinds of people who are attracted to audio engineering and mixing, chances are that those people are often being a little bit too timid and need to learn to be a little bit more bold. Well, a big thanks to you for listening to this episode. Also, a big thanks to you for smashing the living daylights out of the like button on YouTube if you haven't already. If this episode has been useful for you, or if other episodes have been useful for you, and you haven't yet left a rating or review on iTunes, I super duper appreciate it. Seriously, if you can go to like iTunes right now and just rate and review this podcast, type in SonicScoop and just give it a 5-star rating or whatever star number of rating you think is appropriate. And even if you write like 1-sentence review, super short one, it really does help other people discover this podcast and it helps get this message out there. And I really super duper appreciate it and will be your virtual best friend. Also, a big shout out and thanks to our new sponsor for this week, DistroKid. They are easily, and I'm not just saying this because they're sponsoring, but one of the most cost-effective ways, if not the most cost-effective way, to get your music onto places like iTunes, Spotify, Tidal, Google Play, Amazon Music, all of those. Really inexpensive annual fee for as many tracks as you want to upload. And right now, I'm going to get you 7% off of your first year with DistroKid. Just go to distrokid.com/VIP/SonicScoop. That's distrokid.com/VIP/SonicScoop for 7% off your first year with DistroKid. Even if you're migrating from some other service, they are a great one, easy to use, inexpensive to get your stuff out there, and totally worth checking out. Also worth checking out is, I'm going to give you some free stuff in a second, but here's another plug, Focusrite. I'm talking through their interface today. They sent me this lovely Claret 2 Pre to speak through for this podcast, and it has not given me a lick of trouble. It is a wonderful device, and if you're looking for great bang for the buck stuff, Focusrite Scarlett and Claret line is awesome. Also, Eventide, making some of my favorite software and audio effects. Super crazy sound mangler effects. We were talking about being bold in this episode. You want to do some bold stuff, check out Mangled Verb. Check out Fission. Check out Black Hole. Some of the weirdest, coolest, most awesome plugins you'll find. Try out any of them for free at eventideaudio.com. Don't take my word for it. Go to eventideaudio.com and try out any of that stuff for free. Last but not least, speaking about free stuff, you want to learn more about how to EQ really, really well? Do you want to have more like mental breakthroughs when it comes to mixing well? I have got a full-length course called Mixing Breakthroughs. You can check it out at mixingbreakthroughs.com. But if you want a little sample of what's in that course, totally for free, I've got a nice workshop. It's like a 40-minute video workshop called The 5 Habits of Truly Great Mixers, where I tie together the common threads of having not only worked in audio professionally for more than 2 decades now, but studying and interviewing some of the best platinum-selling, Grammy-winning producers and engineers, figuring out what the common threads are in their craft, and then sharing them with people like you. You can get that free workshop at sonicscoop.com/mixhabits. That's sonicscoop.com/mixhabits. Or if you just want to try the full-length course straight away, check it out at mixingbreakthroughs.com. All right. That's enough of me for today. Get out there, happy EQing, put some of this stuff into practice, because that's really where you're going to hear these differences. It's not me mousing around the screen for you, although we do some of that sometimes on this channel, just not in the podcast. But the best way to hear this stuff is to put it into action, see what sounds, works, and feels best for you. So here's your license to go and EQ and be merry and go break some rules and tell me how you do. This has been Justin Colletti of SonicScoop. Thanks for hanging out with me. See you next time.